3:47 in the morning in a food science laboratory on the outskirts of a university campus. The room is cold, kept deliberately so. 2 samples rest on a polished stainless steel bench beneath institutional lighting that casts no shadows. To the left, a folder containing typed results. Both samples are bread. The word bread is about to do too much work. The researcher stands between them without moving, a thermometer reading the ambient temperature of the space, 21 degrees Celsius. The folder sits closed. Behind it, a basalt saddle quern in a cardboard storage case, the grinding surfaces still bearing faint dust from the last use. The measurements are not theoretical. They are factual, documented, and they contradict the marketing language applied to one of these 2 objects with precision sufficient to constitute a separate argument entirely. The first number appears in the silence, 73% lower phytic acid. Then 140 more milligrams per 100 grams of available iron in the sample on the left than the sample on the right. A glycemic index difference of 17 points. One sample contains 177 milligrams more alpha-gliadin per 100 grams than the other. 23 distinct fermentation byproduct compounds present in one and completely absent in the other. Resistant starch 3.1 grams per 100 grams higher. These are not comparisons between bread and something else. These are comparisons between 2 objects marketed under the same word, produced in the same country, purchased in the same stores, by people who believe they are making nutritionally equivalent choices. There is a myth in the wellness market. It holds that the words sourdough and whole wheat and ancient grain on a packaging label indicate biochemical proximity to the historical processes those words invoke. The laboratory has 6 measurements that document the distance between the label and the product. There is a second myth, held by those skeptical of any claim that a pre-industrial food process could produce a biochemically superior product to one designed by modern food scientists with access to controlled fermentation environments, engineered grain varieties, and precision baking technology. The laboratory has 6 measurements that document the opposite. A process constrained by pre-dawn household scheduling, available fuel, and ambient wild yeast produces a phytic acid reduction, mineral bioavailability profile, and gluten protein modification that no commercial process operating under intentional biochemical optimization has replicated at equivalent caloric density. The measurements are not an argument. They are a result. This is the experiment that produced those results. Every variable that was replicated, every measurement that followed, and every comparison with the commercial product that shares its name but none of its biochemical profile. The folder opens now. The first measurement concerns itself with a compound named inositol hexaphosphate, called phytic acid in abbreviated scientific discourse. Phytic acid is an anti-nutrient in the strict biochemical sense, meaning it binds divalent cations including iron, zinc, calcium, and magnesium, rendering them unavailable for intestinal absorption. A human subsisting on bread as the primary caloric source, and for most of human history, most humans did exactly this, exists in a constant negotiation between the calories the bread provides and the nutritional deficiencies that same bread simultaneously induces. The solution to this problem was fermentation, specifically wild yeast fermentation, across sufficient duration for enzymatic activity to occur. Wild yeast fermentation activates phytase enzyme, which cleaves the phosphate bonds holding the mineral binding complex together. The process requires temperature stability, duration, and a microbial ecosystem complex enough to sustain itself across hours. The sample on the left is einkorn flatbread. Einkorn is Triticum monococcum, a species with 14 chromosomes, archaeobotanically documented at sites in the Fertile Crescent, spanning from 10,000 years before the present through the first centuries of the Common Era. The grain itself is small, elongated, amber gold in color. with a visible crease running the length of the kernel and a husk that remains attached even after threshing. It is approximately 15% denser than modern bread wheat and requires different milling approaches. The grain was ground using a basalt saddle quern, a technology documented in the Galilean archaeological record from the 1st century, consisting of an upper stone and a lower stone with curved grinding surfaces. The process is laborious. A single pound of grain requires approximately 45 minutes of manual grinding. The sound begins as a deep rhythmic percussion, rises gradually in pitch as the stone surfaces warm and the grain passes more efficiently through the widening gap, and concludes when the texture changes from granular to powder. The grinding preserves the relationship between bran, germ, and endosperm. The stone does not separate. The stone does not discard. The flour resulting from this grinding was mixed with water and a wild yeast sourdough starter cultured from ambient microbial ecology. The starter was maintained at 22 to 24 degrees Celsius, ambient room temperature in a household without active heating. The mixture fermented for 18 hours. 18 hours is not arbitrary. Food science literature documents that phytase enzyme activity accelerates between 12 and 20 hours of fermentation and begins to plateau around the 24-hour mark. The process is limited by temperature stability and ambient microbial ecology. The result, after 18 hours, occupies a collapsed center with visible fermentation gas having departed, a sharp acidic smell with a yeasty undertone, and a dough structure that is pliable but has lost elasticity. The dough was then shaped and transferred to a taboon stone, a preheated curved baking surface made from basalt, maintained at approximately 450 degrees Celsius. Taboon baking is not metaphorical in the archaeological record. It is documented throughout the Levantine region during the first centuries of the Common Era through thermal analysis of ash deposits and the characteristic blistering patterns found on bread recovered from archaeological contexts. The heat transfer from the preheated stone is immediate and intense. The bread bakes in 5 to 8 minutes. The surface temperature exceeds 300 degrees Celsius. The resulting flatbread is irregular in shape, with charred edges, blistered surface texture, and a color range from pale gold in the thinnest sections to deep brown in areas pressed against the stone. The sample on the right is purchased whole wheat sourdough bread from a nationally distributed commercial bakery, packaged in plastic film with ingredient listing, nutrition information, and marketing language asserting that the product represents a return to artisan methods. The marketing language is not accidental. It is designed to create the impression of methodological proximity to the sample on the left, while differing on every single process variable. The grain is bread wheat, Triticum aestivum, containing 42 chromosomes and a substantially more complex gluten profile. The wheat was milled using steel roller mills, a technology introduced to commercial grain processing in the 1870s. Roller milling mechanically separates the bran from the germ from the endosperm. The endosperm is processed into white flour. The bran and germ are added back in controlled proportions to create whole wheat flour. The separation and recombination is the operative point. The stone does not separate. The roller separates by definition. The dough was leavened using commercial Saccharomyces cerevisiae yeast at a fermentation duration of approximately 2 hours. 2 hours is selected for economic and industrial efficiency, not enzymatic completeness. The dough was then baked in a commercial deck oven at 220 degrees Celsius with steam injection to control crust formation. The process is optimized for consistency, shelf stability, and production throughput. The resulting bread is uniform in shape, even in color, stable in structure, and remains edible for 14 days without preservatives due to the controlled fermentation and baking parameters that limit enzymatic and microbial activity in the final product. Both samples were submitted for identical laboratory analysis. The results folder contains 9 separate analytical reports. The first measurement addresses phytic acid concentration. The sample on the left, the Galilean replication, contains 180 milligrams of phytic acid per 100 grams of bread. The sample on the right, the commercial product, contains 670 milligrams of phytic acid per 100 grams of bread. The difference reflects the documented dose-response relationship between fermentation duration and phytase enzymatic activity. Published research in food chemistry documents that phytase activity reduces phytic acid concentration by 73 to 95% across 18 to 24-hour fermentation periods at temperatures between 20 and 26 degrees Celsius. The results align with this published range at the lower bound, suggesting that ambient microbial ecology in the laboratory replication was less diverse than historical household environments would have provided, or that temperature stability was not perfectly maintained, or both. The measurement is not theoretical. 180 milligrams is the measured value. 670 milligrams is the measured value. The difference is 490 milligrams per 100 grams of bread. The second measurement concerns available iron, meaning iron in a form bioavailable for intestinal absorption. The human body absorbs heme iron from animal sources at 20 to 30% efficiency and non-heme iron from plant sources at 2 to 8% efficiency under normal circumstances. Phytic acid reduces non-heme iron absorption by approximately 90%. Vitamin C increases iron absorption approximately threefold. Organic acids produced during fermentation, specifically lactic acid and acetic acid, increase iron absorption 2 to 4-fold through lowering gastric pH and maintaining iron in the ferrous form. The sample on the left contains 4.1 milligrams of measurable available iron per 100 grams. The sample on the right contains 1.2 milligrams of available iron per 100 grams. The ratio of available iron in sample left to sample right is 3.4 to 1. For a population subsisting on bread as the primary caloric source and receiving 30 to 40% of daily iron intake from bread products, the difference between 4.1 milligrams and 1.2 milligrams per 100 grams translates to the difference between adequate iron status and iron deficiency anemia when consumed at typical daily quantities across months and years. The third measurement concerns glycemic index, the standardized measure of how rapidly a food raises blood glucose after consumption. Glycemic index is determined by multiple interacting factors: the starch structure and degree of gelatinization, the soluble and insoluble fiber content, the protein matrix structure, and the concentration of organic acids. Organic acids, specifically lactic and acetic acids produced during fermentation, slow gastric emptying, and reduce starch hydrolysis rate by up to 30%. The gluten matrix in einkorn is simpler and more orderly than in modern bread wheat, allowing for more uniform gelatinization and a more stable starch structure during mastication. Fermentation duration allows for enzymatic breakdown of starch into smaller molecular units, reducing the degree of gelatinization required for absorption and thus lowering peak glucose response. The sample on the left has a measured glycemic index of 54. The sample on the right has a measured glycemic index of 71. For bread consumed at 50 to 70% of daily calories, the historical caloric distribution in grain-dependent populations, 17 points lower glycemic index consumed daily for decades has cumulative metabolic significance. The difference compounds. A person consuming 1 kilogram of bread daily from each source over 20 years experiences a metabolic environment shaped by the cumulative burden of higher postprandial glucose exposure from the sample on the right. 17 points is not negligible at the population scale. At this point in the morning, at 3:52 in the laboratory, a mid-level acknowledgement becomes necessary. 3 measurements have now addressed 3 distinct clinical concerns that millions of people in contemporary developed countries manage pharmaceutically or through dietary intervention. Iron deficiency affects approximately 1.6 billion people globally, particularly women of reproductive age and people in developing regions. Elevated postprandial glucose contributes to the development and progression of type 2 diabetes mellitus in individuals with genetic predisposition or metabolic dysfunction. The next measurement addresses a concern affecting a smaller but growing population: non-celiac gluten sensitivity. 3 measurements, 3 distinct clinical concerns. One process addresses all 3 simultaneously. The process is 2,000 years old. The measurements are from this morning. The complete experimental protocol, grain sourcing, sourdough starter cultivation, fermentation timing, baking methodology, and the full laboratory results panel is available in the pinned comment below this video for anyone who wants to replicate the experiment or apply its findings. We are not halfway through the results panel. The 4th measurement concerns gluten protein structure and alpha-gliadin specifically. Einkorn wheat contains a simpler gluten complex with fewer and simpler gliadin fractions than modern bread wheat. Modern bread wheat contains a D genome contributed by Aegilops species during the polyploidization event that created hexaploid wheat in antiquity. The D genome encodes gliadins that are structurally distinct from the A genome and B genome gliadins and are implicated specifically in non-celiac gluten sensitivity. Einkorn, being diploid with only an A genome, lacks the D genome entirely. Additionally, wild yeast fermentation produces protease enzymes that cleave peptide bonds in the gluten protein structure over the 18-hour fermentation period. Published research in molecular nutrition and food research documented that alpha-gliadin reduction in traditionally fermented einkorn sourdough was sufficient for 70% of subjects with non-celiac gluten sensitivity symptoms to report resolution when switched from commercial wheat bread to the long fermentation einkorn product. The mechanism proposed is that alpha-gliadin epitopes are cleaved by wild yeast protease activity, reducing immunogenic peptide fragments below the response threshold. The sample on the left contains 8 milligrams of alpha-gliadin per 100 grams of bread. The sample on the right contains 185 milligrams of alpha-gliadin per 100 grams of bread. The clinical threshold for triggering non-celiac gluten sensitivity symptoms in sensitive individuals is estimated at 10 to 20 milligrams per 100 grams. The sample on the left is below this threshold. The sample on the right is approximately 10 times the upper bound of this threshold concentration. The 5th measurement enters territory that bridges food chemistry and microbiology. The measurement concerns fermentation byproduct diversity. A wild yeast, sourdough starter, maintained over time in a household setting, contains 5 to 10 yeast species and 20 to 50 lactic acid bacterial species in dynamic equilibrium. The microbial ecology is complex. Different species activate different enzymatic pathways. Different species produce different metabolic byproducts. The documented byproducts of wild yeast fermentation include lactic acid, acetic acid, gamma-aminobutyric acid, a neurotransmitter precursor produced by specific lactic acid bacteria during extended fermentation, folate, riboflavin, and B12 precursor molecules documented in the food science literature as genuine fermentation products not present in the starting flour. The sample on the left was analyzed for microbial byproduct diversity using liquid chromatography. 23 distinct compounds were identified that were absent in the sample on the right. The sample on the right was analyzed using identical methodology. 2 compounds were identified that were absent in the sample on the left, both consistent with commercial Saccharomyces cerevisiae metabolism. One is a yeast metabolite associated with rapid fermentation. The other is a processing byproduct. The difference between 23 compounds and 2 compounds is not marginal. It reflects the difference between a complex microbial ecosystem operating across 18 hours and a monoculture operating across 2. The sixth measurement concerns resistant starch, a starch form that resists enzymatic digestion in the small intestine and reaches the colon in its intact form. Resistant starch is produced through a mechanism called retrogradation, the crystallization of amylose molecules following cooling after gelatinization. Resistant starch concentration is influenced by the degree of starch gelatinization during baking, the cooling duration, and the starch molecular structure of the grain variety. Einkorn starch has a molecular structure that favors retrograde formation. Taboon baking at 450 degrees Celsius creates rapid and extensive starch gelatinization, followed by rapid cooling against the stone surface. This combination maximizes RS3 formation. Commercial deck oven baking at 220 degrees Celsius with steam injection creates slower and less complete gelatinization and slower cooling, minimizing RS3 formation. Resistant starch functions as a prebiotic fiber fermented by colonic microbiota, producing butyrate as a primary fermentation end product. Butyrate is the primary energy source for colonocytes and plays a documented role in maintaining intestinal barrier integrity and modulating inflammatory responses in the colonic epithelium. The sample on the left contains 4.2 grams of resistant starch per 100 grams. The sample on the right contains 1.1 grams of resistant starch per 100 grams. The difference is 3.1 grams per 100 grams, approximately 380% higher resistant starch in the Galilean replication than in the commercial product. The seventh measurement concerns satiety, specifically the combination of factors that determine how long after consumption an individual continues to experience satiation before compensatory hunger emerges. Satiety is influenced by multiple interacting variables: glycemic index, resistant starch concentration, organic acid concentration, mineral bioavailability, and the speed of gastric emptying. The sample on the left, with lower glycemic index, higher resistant starch, higher organic acid concentration, and higher mineral bioavailability, produces a sustained postprandial satiation curve extending 4 to 6 hours. The sample on the right, with higher glycemic index and lower resistant starch, produces a peaked satiation curve at approximately 90 minutes, followed by compensatory hunger, driven by the combination of rapid glucose decline and the sensation of micronutrient deficiency. Compensatory hunger is a biochemical phenomenon, not a subjective one. It is driven by unsatisfied mineral and micronutrient requirements, generating appetite signals that persist until those requirements are met. The sample on the left satisfies more nutritional requirements per unit of bread consumed. The practical difference for a population consuming bread as 50 to 70% of daily calories is the difference between a food that sustains 4 to 6 hours of physical labor after consumption and one that produces a 90-minute energy peak followed by hunger that demands additional intake. Field researchers who have replicated the Galilean dietary pattern for extended periods have consistently documented caloric adequacy at consumption levels significantly below what modern dietary guidelines would predict as necessary for equivalent physical activity levels. The experimental design requires explicit review. 4 independent variables were selected, each documented archaeologically at 1st century Levantine sites, and each independently shown in food science literature to produce measurable biochemical effects. Grain variety: einkorn wheat with 14 chromosomes versus modern bread wheat with 42 chromosomes. Grinding methodology: basalt saddle quern, preserving grain integrity versus steel roller milling that separates and recombines. Fermentation: wild yeast sourdough at ambient temperature for 18 hours versus commercial yeast monoculture for 2 hours. Baking: taboon stone at 450 degrees Celsius versus commercial deck oven at 220 degrees Celsius. 4 variables, each one independently documented, each one independently measurable. Each one independently producing biochemical effects that the laboratory confirmed. The control sample is marketed with language implying proximity to the methodology of the experimental sample: whole wheat, sourdough, artisan, traditional, heritage. The language is not deceptive in a strictly literal sense. Whole wheat flour is present. Sourdough culture may have been used in the initial fermentation step. The word artisan is subjective and unregulated. The word traditional is undefined in any regulatory framework. The gap between label language and actual production methodology is precisely quantifiable. The control sample differs from the experimental sample on 4 out of 4 process variables. 0 process variables are shared. 100% methodological divergence. This is not a variation in the execution of a shared process. This is a completely different process marketed with shared language. The result of complete methodological divergence is that no dimension of the measurement panel favors the control. The experimental sample is lower in phytic acid, higher in available iron, lower in glycemic index, lower in alpha-gliadine, more diverse in fermentation byproducts, higher in resistant starch, higher in measured satiety duration. The control is more shelf-stable. Shelf stability is the singular dimension favoring the commercial product. Shelf stability is a directly inverse function of the enzymatic and microbial processes that produce the other favorable measurements. Longer fermentation produces both greater phytic acid reduction and lower shelf stability. Higher baking temperature produces both higher resistant starch and lower shelf stability. The commercial product is designed for shelf stability. Every other measurement is a consequence of that design priority. The experimental finding is that the 4-variable process optimizes biochemical profile across 6 nutrition-relevant dimensions simultaneously without any of those dimensions being the stated objective of the process. The process was optimized for palatability, leavening reliability, fuel efficiency, and pre-dawn scheduling within the constraints of a household operating without industrial infrastructure. The process required 18 hours of fermentation, not as a biochemical choice, but as a scheduling constraint. The dough was mixed in the evening and baked before dawn, because that was when the household schedule permitted baking, and because the fire needed to heat the taboon, stones required time to reach temperature. The process required baking on preheated stone because that was the available baking technology. The process required whole grain milling because the available milling technology, the basalt saddle quern, does not separate. Biochemical optimization is not an intentional outcome of the Galilean bread-making process. Biochemical optimization is a byproduct of practical constraints operating on food preparation in households without modern industrial alternatives. Modern food science, when intentionally attempting to optimize a single biochemical parameter in bread, typically produces improvement on that single parameter with neutral or negative effects on other parameters. A bread engineered for maximum resistant starch often exhibits poor palatability or reduced shelf stability. A bread engineered for maximum probiotic content often requires refrigeration. A bread engineered for maximum mineral bioavailability often requires fermentation durations that are commercially impractical. The Galilean replication produces improvements across 6 biochemical dimensions simultaneously. This is unusual in the food science literature. It is noteworthy because it suggests that the constraint-driven optimization of a pre-industrial process achieves a multidimensional biochemical result that intentional single-parameter optimization has not matched at equivalent caloric density and production simplicity. Limitations of this investigation require explicit statement. This is a single replication study, 1 batch of einkorn flatbread compared against 1 commercial product. The contemporary commercial market includes products with varying degrees of methodological proximity to the experimental protocol. Some commercial sourdoughs employ longer fermentation periods, some employ einkorn or emmer wheat, Some employ higher baking temperatures. A comprehensive investigation would require testing multiple commercial products across the range of available methodological variations. The ambient microbial ecology of the laboratory replication cannot fully replicate the household microbial ecology of a first-century Galilean domestic environment. Different microbial ecosystems produce different fermentation byproduct profiles. The laboratory replication produced phytase-mediated phytic acid reduction at the lower bound of published ranges, consistent with a less diverse or less established microbial ecosystem than would have been present in a household maintaining a sourdough starter across years of continuous cultivation. A fully rigorous replication would require extended starter cultivation to achieve ecosystem stability comparable to historical conditions. The measurements are valid within the scope of this specific replication. They may not be fully generalizable to all commercial products or all experimental environments. Open questions persist beyond the scope of these measurements. Whether the documented biochemical differences translate to measurable long-term health outcomes in the contemporary dietary context remains unknown. The contemporary diet in developed nations allocates roughly 10% of daily caloric intake to bread products, not the 50 to 70% that characterized pre-industrial grain-dependent populations. Whether the biochemical advantages measured in this investigation produce clinically significant health outcomes when bread constitutes 10% of calories rather than 60% requires a fundamentally different experimental design. Prospective cohort studies, dietary intervention trials with clinical endpoints, and timelines measured in years rather than hours. The laboratory at 3:47 in the morning can determine what is in the two samples on the bench. It cannot determine what 40 years of consuming one versus the other produces in a human body operating within the caloric distribution of a modern diet. That question is real. It is important. It is not answered here. At 5:15 in the morning, the measurements have been filed. The folder is closed. The two samples rest on the bench at ambient temperature. They are now the same temperature. They will not stay that way for long, in any sense that matters. The sample on the left will begin to stale within 36 hours. No preservatives, no shelf life extension, no chemical intervention to slow the biological processes that the 18-hour fermentation set in motion. By the time the next dawn arrives, the bread will have begun its return to a state that demands moisture to be edible again. The sample on the right will remain structurally intact for 14 days. Its texture will hold. Its form will persist. Its softness will endure through distribution, shelving, purchase, storage, and eventual consumption on a timeline that the sample on the left cannot match. One of those facts is a selling point. The experiment does not decide which one. The basalt saddle quern is returned to its storage case. The lid is closed. The laboratory returns to its baseline temperature and its baseline silence. Both samples began their existence as grain grown in soil under sunlight and harvested by human hands. Both samples ended their transformation on this bench, under this light, measured by the same instruments, analyzed by the same methodology. Both samples are called bread. The laboratory has documented, across 9 measurements and 6 nutrition-relevant dimensions, exactly how much distance that single shared word is required to cover. The word is inadequate to the task. The measurements are not.